Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. We're back for our first regular episode of the year. I hope you all enjoyed the year in review for 2022. You all seem to have enjoyed that. Everyone seemed to have a positive reaction. So, just out of the way, late Merry Christmas to those of you on the Gregorian calendar. Happy New Year to those of you also on the Gregorian calendar. And I did not forget. I did not forget you, my friend. I did not forget several of you. Merry Christmas to those on the Julian calendar as well. And I understand that
Thank
your
you.
New Year's will be here in just a few days now, so I'll keep my eye out for that.
A few
Just
more days,
yeah,
yeah.
just some brief pre-show stuff. I will be out of town for a good week and a half, so you might not get an episode for about a week and a half there, and we'll see if we can arrange something if GSP wants to try to do a show on his own or find somebody else to do along with them. We'll get that all arranged behind the scenes, but just to let you know, we might be a little short on episodes this month. But plenty has happened just within these first 10 days of the year. We were recording the night of January 10th, 2023. This will premiere the evening of January 11th, 2023. So we have plenty to cover. We have, of course, the updates on the major news out of Ukraine, plenty of Europe news, plenty of news out of East Asia, some of the stuff going on in Latin America with the attempts in Brazil, and this burgeoning unstable situation in Mexico as well, and then a bit of Asian news, and we might touch on Congress if we have time, the debacle that happened there. And then we also do have an article that we'd like to go over that was put out about a month ago in the beginning and middle of December from the Jamestown Institute, which we'll get into after some of the Ukraine stuff. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to you because I know you have a lot to say tonight. And go ahead.
Okay. Well, well, thank you for the wish. Yeah, so to get into it, uh, um, look at we're going to talk about the attack on the Russian Barefoot City and some of the lead up to it, some of the strange things that days prior. Uh, Even before on the 23rd of November, there was a family, Bass, I believe, in the Lugansk area, um, were killed. All of them with bullet wounds to the head. Three of them were children, 1, 3, and 7. The mother uh, shot at point blank. Some people tried to say it's robbery. I don't believe that people did get nothing's ever happened, and this story has just tapered off. And the reason I bring it up is because there is still a infiltration problem, I think, in the regions that Russia controls. And, and in Lugansk, in the Belgorod region of Russia, which is just north of Ukraine. Um, and even in Moscow, people have put up like posts of coordinates to attack, which I found really odd, right? So I bring it up because obviously the war right now is in a very hot stage, and, and, and there are real costs to people on both sides of the war. And I think each side is determined that the other one has to lose at this point. After the 23rd and beginning around Russia, a series of missile attacks that were, even for the ones in November and October, are kind of unprecedented. They exceeded well above what people saw at the beginning of this war back in February 2022. And I'll read you like some of the places that were hit. Konstantinovka. This is the last line of defense, basically from, let's say, the next city all the way to the Dnieper River and Zaporozhye. Um, this would have been on the 30th, I believe. Uh, there was an attack on Liman. This is the town that the Russians lost back, I believe, in September. And this was a police station. And from the photos that I see, it looked like it could have housed, the Russians claim it housed a barracks. There was an Iskander in the Chernigov region that hit a barracks. Um, in Kramatorsk, there was a hit. Now, a bit before Christmas, the Georgian Legion got itself caught in Opitne. And this is the suburb of Bakhmut. 90% of it now is controlled by the Russians, but the Legion did get stuck there, and there were many dead. You could, you know, on Twitter, you saw posts about this, and there was a desperate attempt to free them. I think some of them were freed. Um, however, other towns were hit: Kiev, Kharkov, Vinnytsia. Um, on the let's say on December 31st, there was an even bigger strike. I'm talking about, like, usually the Russians do about 70, 75 missiles. This is about 100 to 125, and that's according to Ukrainian sources. So it's not my sources. Now, there was an important town that I've never heard of that the Russians kept attacking before New Year's Eve and after New Year's Eve. It's Klemensky. This town is about halfway between Kiev and the Polish border. It's slightly south of where Kiev would be. Um, they attacked it, I believe, on the 31st and on the 1st of January of this year. And apparently the 8th Regiment was there. So also, a hotel in Kiev where it was suspected that there were probably both foreign mercenaries and NATO trainers there. That was knocked, like an enormous chunk of it, like literally fell off. So my guess is that that what it- the Ukrainians wanted revenge, basically, for all these multiple hits. Now, there were many others. Okhovka, which is down ways by Nikolaev, on the shores of the Black Sea. That's been hit a few times, and we know that there were British trainers there. It's been hit no less than three times in this week alone. Odessa, Lvov, Kiev, the Kiev region, Sumy. There are literally too many towns to mention. And, you know, one of the Izvestia News, they had a young woman, a teenager, maybe 16, 17 years old, maybe 18, I don't know. And she claimed that actually the locals knew that the Russians were in the business to house them. Uh, uh, Back. So, you know, far say it was, the soldiers calling their loved ones on New Year's Eve at the stroke of night, and I mean that's a possibility. But what I'm trying to say is that the local think that there were that there are locals who are giving away coordinates. Okay, um, and I think it's easier to no, strategically to claim that it was the soldiers who probably did do, who probably did phone loved ones. How many, I don't know. And the death toll now is 89 and about 40 injured. And it couldn't hold more than 150. So the Ukrainian reports of 400 to 600 dead seems unlikely. But if you look at, there are scores dead for sure. There was a Canadian Merc that did an interview, if I'm not mistaken, because it was months ago, on CBC here in Canada, a guy named McDonald, and he said 35 mercenaries were killed at one point. They were camping in tents, and somehow the Russians found out about them, and that's that. Um, and the other interesting thing is, I mentioned that Kramatorsk was hit, and there was a Georgian Legion there, and the environs around Kramatorsk. There are other villages around that town. That town is about the size of Bakhmut, roughly speaking. So that with Slavyansk is a larger agglomeration than, let's say, Bakhmut and Solidar, slightly larger. Um, it was report now the Russians did claim that there were HIMARS there that they spotted moving out of that region about 2 or 3 days before the HIMARS attack on the school itself, where the Russian barracks, where the Russian soldiers were in their barracks. Um, so this is something I haven't heard anybody else say. Because like one of the things in all the years that I've been following this war is the Russian government, or who killed Motorola? The Russian government. And I've always suspicious of that. Simply because the Ukrainians have like people who can easily infiltrate. They speak the language perfectly. They look just like like the orcs. And
The fine line
so
between true
I've
Aryan and
never,
Orc.
yes, it's a very fine line. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, especially with Givy and Motorola, as soon as Strelkov was taken out of the picture, Givy and Motorola were not trying to mount new offensives against the Ukrainians. Okay, so no, this was retribution for the Ukrainians losing in Donbass, both in August and then of 2014, and then in January, February of 2015 in Debaltseve. So to clarify that's what I think is because of just how massive the Russian attacks have been. It's only been about a week, a little over a week since those attacks. Uh, and I know we forget these things really quickly. Now, uh, there was on French television, and I believe it's Drushkova, a town it's in the Donbass, but it's several tens of kilometers outside of Donetsk. And live on air, as the French television show was running, um, a missile attack hit what appears to be. There was confusion about whether it was a railroad station or not. There were beds all over the place. I didn't see bodies or anything, but the Russians claim possibly like as much as 135 dead or in that area. So that was well, sorry, about 70 foreign mercenaries and more than 100 wounded is what the Russians claimed. Sorry, in Kramatorsk. I'm getting them mixed up. I'm sorry. Um, the attack in Drushkova, um, I don't see the exact number, but the Russians claim that two French Vampire MLRS systems were destroyed, as one or two HIMARS were destroyed. The Russians even claimed these they hit some other uh, barracks, and the Russians claimed the like, and this is like another example of like the Russians really showing that they don't really care about optics that much, and they're not very good at propaganda. How do you substantiate it? Like I saw the two buildings that they this was the case. Um, the other reason I probably don't believe 600 is one of the things that we saw in this war is it's had many successful hits all throughout Ukraine, uh, in Chernigov, in the Kharkov area, Vinnytsia, and there was one. I forget where it was, but even the Ukrainians were saying over 200 dead. It came in April, and it was just after the attack on Lvov. And what I'm trying to get at is both sides have learned to spread out the bear, not have large concentrations in one area. This goes both for fuel reserves, ammunition depots. You remember, like when this war started, how Russia would like take over a town, especially in the spring, and then they would find like huge stores of weaponry, mostly missiles and grenades and so on, right, and ammunition. So I think that stage, both sides have learned not to concentrate all of their manpower and material in one area, and even the Russians have changed their tactics. Uh, I was reading a report earlier today where the Russians are now attacking in smaller groups, right, to take over these areas. So this nonsense that you hear in the Western press about like waves, nobody has been fighting waves in this war. Definitely not in the last 5 months. Uh, they can't afford that. Uh, so, anyways, that's if we go to the front lines. The front lines in the south are the Georgia region that everybody was talking about all throughout December and late November that the Ukrainians would commit to in order to dive into that hasn't materialized. And the reason for that is the pressure in Bakhmut, no matter how slow it's been, has forced the Ukrainians to send as many troops from this area in order for Bakhmut not to fall. There was a small town on the Zaporozhye border, and I mean small, that the Russians took over 6 days ago, maybe. Starts with a D. Honestly, I can't remember it. It's not like I don't know if this place even has like 1,000 people. There's probably nobody there, to be quite honest, at this stage in the war. The areas where the lines are shifting, of course, is in Bakhmut. And the big news today is Solidar. Solidar is, for all intents and purposes, captured. Uh, Prigozhin has already posed for photos in salt mine number 4. For people who don't know, Solidar had like some of the biggest salt mines in the world. Even in the 19th century, tourists went there. And there are
And there's a
several
bit
of
of a
them.
double meaning to that,
The
given
biggest,
recent events.
yes, yes. I've seen a tiny, tiny bit of this on Twitter. Um, so salt mine number 7 is almost captured. And now there's much like Mariupol, there are rumors now that there's a vast array of tunnels that connect Solidar to Bakhmut, and this may be the reasons why certain areas in Bakhmut the Ukrainians could supply with new men, getting shelled along the way, because some of the routes used to deliver new material and men to hold the Russians off in Bakhmut, many of these roads now are they're inoperable, right? Like in October, the southern road connecting like Avdiivka to Bakhmut was mostly intact. The roads that went southwest, let's say to Konstantinovka, were mostly now they're still good, but the southern part now, like forget it. There's a town called Klishchiivka that's on the hill. The Russians have begun storming this town. It's a village. This is like a satellite village of Bakhmut, okay? And instead of going across the field, they're going, the grid of these farmers outline the farmers' fields. And they're going very closely with the tanks next to the trees. So if any of these guys have a man pad that could take out, they're very ineffective firing from within range. The probability of it hitting another tree is highly likely. And so this is the way they've been attacking from the sides. Now they've taken a part of Klishchiivka, and that is enough like a southwesternly direction that the Ukrainians could use. But it's still a good distance away from Chasov Yar, which is a town like directly in between that whole agglomerate of Konstantinovka, Kramatorsk, and Bakhmut on the east side. It's a small town, not a village, but a small town. And there are like forces there that are used to replenish and so on. The other thing about Bakhmut, of course, is it's like a central hub for all these different railways. And again, railways can be repaired within like 48 hours. I get it. I get it. But I'm still amazed that the Russians haven't done more of this. Bridges are harder. And for anyone who says, well, that's because they intend to go all the way. Like, I think this is such a stupid hope. Like, when the Russians retreated out of Kherson, they blew up those bridges. Two bridges have already been blown up by the Ukrainians in the Bakhmut area and in Bakhmut proper. We're just not at that stage anymore. Like, this war has really matured, let's say. Um, so the taking of Solidar is going to be very pivotal because it stops all northernly communications that Bakhmut has with Seversk. Seversk is that town that is west of Lysychansk, but before Slavyansk. And if they keep driving north, they will create another culture the way they did when the Russians took over Popasnaya, which I believe was in May. And they did something similar when they took over Liman. But the Russians seem to be going much slower about this. I think they're much more concerned about keeping casualties down to a minimum. It's hilarious too that in Solidar, where like they have so many mercenaries that are fighting there. In fact, two British mercenaries, including one who is the son of a medic, they've gone missing the last day or two. No one has heard from them. Um, it's amazing because Wagner is outnumbered in Solidar, and they're basically the ones responsible. Now, earlier on, let's say from 2 days ago, they were receiving help from both the militias and from the Chechens in this area, but Wagner in the last 24 hours, this is their battle in Solidar. And I have I have some very interesting now. We know that some of the fighters that the Russians are committing to the front lines within the Wagner organization, the private military organization, um, we know that some of them are criminals, right? Now, I personally know somebody who is in Russia who got out of prison and was asked with 2 weeks left to his sentence. He was asked to join, and I mean, it's hard to describe, but the face he made to give me an idea of how he spoke back to the Wagner recruiter was like, "Are you crazy? I'm going to be out in 14 days. I'm not going to go join." You think I'm going to go now? So it's oh man, he is not like some of the other guys. Let's just say. Um, so I mean, in his what he was convicted of, I won't say any more about that. But I just thought I'd share that. So um, this is an incredible amount of success that they've had. I honestly did thought like Solidar would take longer. The thing with Solidar now is a central part of Solidar is completely controlled by Wagner. There's no way to get in. Wagner claims there are hundreds, not 1,000, but hundreds of Ukrainian officers and soldiers that are trapped in there. They promise that in the morning we will find out how many have surrendered or will not surrender. There's videos of Ukrainian soldiers who say that they've been deserted by their officers, mostly officers from Western Ukraine, in the Solidar region. The other thing about why Solidar is really important is this. The gains that the Russians were making in south of Bakhmut, the problem is that the more west they go, the closer they will get to the other line of defense, which is Konstantinovka, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, and Chasov Yar is in the middle between that line and Bakhmut. Trying to take all of that and not having taken Bakhmut will be very difficult. However, uh, north of Bakhmut, which Solidar is basically like let's say it's like a suburb of Bakhmut. It's a town in its own right, uh, close. So if the Russians basically cut off Bakhmut from the north, that leaves Seversk completely on its own to the north. Any help it gets, it will have to go a long distance to Slavyansk. It will have to come from there. So it will be much easier for the Russians to begin enveloping Bakhmut, not from the south, but from the north. So as far as the front Kharkov and Liman, Kupiansk, that whole area, there were reports earlier last week that the Ukrainians had taken over one of the towns. That is not true. There have not been any gains in that area. And you're beginning to see more and more articles. CNN actually had a Ukrainian soldier talking about Solidar that on the basis of anonymity that there are so many dead and so knows how many. Um, so the Western press is kind of for maybe the loss of Solidar, but the loss of Solidar, I think, will be only the beginning. That is, they will try to hold on to Bakhmut, I think. I could be wrong, but I think they're going to hold on to Bakhmut longer than they try to hold on to Lysychansk, which is literally the other town on the other side of the border. Back in June, late June, early July, I was surprised how quickly the Ukrainians let go of that. But I would imagine that Bakhmut is more central. Because one of the things that the Ukrainians kind of depend upon is if things are going very badly, they will just indiscriminately start shooting missiles in residential areas of Donetsk City and the Donetsk City suburbs. And that's very hard to do right now if they Bakhmut, right?
And
That
that's
will
all
give
on
the
top of dwindling NATO
Russians a lot of
supplies.
momentum. The other, right. So, I mean, why don't we get into that? That's it for the front lines. I will say this: that Annalena Baerbock was in Kharkov today. She was in a tour of Kharkov, and I don't know whether they're still in town, but the Russians started firing missiles later in the early evening, and they hit a fireworks silo, and it's literally just fireworks going off. It, I just thought it was ironic and kind of crazy that that happened.
Hell of a
But
spectacle, to
we can
say the
start
least.
getting into yeah. At first, I'm going like, "What is this? These are fireworks. This is what is going on? The Russians they're firing fireworks.
I mean,
Is that
I
base?
can see the Washington Post article already. In a desperate move, as Putin runs out of ammunition, he launches fireworks at Ukraine. Oh
It's
yeah,
not, guys. It's not phosphorus. It's fireworks.
that's a good one. Netanyahu should remember that one. But with that being said, with that very nice summary of what's going on the front lines, I do think we need to contrast that with this little project I've had in the works for the past couple days regarding an article put out by the Jamestown Foundation. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, it is one of these NGO think tank type of organizations that formed towards the end of the Cold War that was targeted primarily on defectors and dissidents from Eastern Bloc nations. And they put out an article with a very brazen title that I just want to do an on air read of as just go through it piece by piece. It's not too long. This shouldn't take us too long. But I just want to show you what we have here. So here is the brazen title. Let
Mhm.
me just read that. A, quote, Morgantown Plan, unquote, for Russia, avoiding the post-1991 mistakes, dealing with a post-Putin Russia, Part 1. And this is by Sergei Hankin. Now, I'm not familiar with this individual, but he does sound like, at least name-wise, he fits the bill of the Eastern Bloc Russian dissident living abroad in the West and kvetching in whatever media article. So, I'll begin here. Moscow's all-out war of aggression against Ukraine, which commenced February 24th. You have to love how they always started out like that, how they have to cover all their bases. There was certainly, and one day for no reason, all Russia invaded, has vividly demonstrated that Russia's militarism and drive towards colonial expansion has not disappeared. This has, in turn, revealed the arguments in supporting the notion that economic growth and inclusion in major international organization would bring Russia stability and would bring stability and normalization to Russia have largely failed. Now, I'm not going to nitpick every sentence of this, but I do have to say that is a rather rich statement, as you had throughout the early 2000s Putin trying to join all these organizations, trying to join NATO, pushing for greater cooperation with the European Union, and turned away at every opportunity that the West had, and that, of course, culminates in Georgia 2008, Ukraine 2014, etc., etc. But once again, I won't get too bogged down in detail. I just want to go through this briefly. The war against Ukraine has also underscored the bitter reality that Russia is indeed the number one threat to European security, American-led European security, I might add. Additionally, the conflict
Mhm.
has revealed staggering discrepancy between the pre-war image of Russia, which was skillfully crafted by Moscow's own propaganda, and the Kremlin's open and tacit support in the West, and woeful reality of the deeply corrupt, criminalized, economically weakened, and militarily archaic country. The absolute brazenness will continue on, though.
Mhm.
Meanwhile, the international
You
sanctions.
know what I love about
No,
this
go ahead, go
is,
ahead.
go ahead.
No, no, please continue. I want to hear what you love about this.
Sorry. What I love is like, here's what's so stupid about this, right? So in 2000, Bush, Putin asks uh, Bush if Russia could join NATO. He had asked before, but of course they laughed it off, right? Like, so, oh, because why get off? If Russia was in NATO, there would be nothing to worry about, right? Well, of course, because the balkanization of Russia has always been there, right? That has always been a Western project. Anyhow, that's where I leave it.
Oh, you'll love what this article has to say next, and the parts 2 and 3 have to say next if you're bringing that up already. So, to continue, meanwhile, international sanctions in the economic sphere, the impact of which is likely to acquire a more powerful effect in the coming months, are now slowly strangling Russia, resulting in declining living standards and flight of foreign investors. Clearly troubled by this, Moscow has considered strengthening command administrative methods, best reflected in the Gosplan 2.0 model, as a remedy. See EDM, September 7th. For now, the so-called parallel import mechanism, in which Turkey plays a key role, remains the main lifeboat saving Russia from Soviet-style budget deficit. YouTube, November 2019. And I'll link these articles below if you want to pick through them yourselves and have fun with that. Simultaneously, the Kremlin's strategic dependency on China has gradually transformed of one into economic dependence. RBC, November 15th. Once again, we have this narrative that the sanctions will collapse Russia any day. Now, I believe that, yes, in large part, it has made life somewhat harder for the Russian people. In terms of economically cratering the state, we have not seen that yet, and we are not likely to see that. Now, it may put them behind in fields of more advanced technologies as they are deprived of that, but as we'll get into later in the show with the development of chips by Huawei, and I mean, they even cite quote unquote economic dependence with China. There are methods around that, but I do believe, look, in devil's advocate here, there has been some setbacks of Russia economically because of these sanctions, but in terms of them being civilization ending as they may hope them to be, I don't think that's in the cards. And once again, I'll touch on the China issue. Looking at the relationship between Russia and China, at this point, you can't really say one is dependent on the other. I mean, just for the energy question alone, with how much energy China imports from Russia, that alone should disqualify it from being an economic dependence. Sure, you can say it props up the Russian economy, however much, but once again, where else is China going to turn to get the amount of energy that it needs? Now, although they are expanding, they're making deals with Iran, Saudi Arabia, etc., they're still mostly relying on Russia. So it's a bit, I guess you could say, a codependent relationship, but I'll put that aside for now as I continue on with this. Domestically, the Russian political elites are losing the confidence and legitimacy, while criminals such as Wagner Group, headed by Yevgeny Prigozhin, and local warlords, primarily Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov, are directly challenging Russia's military commanders, and then the citation they have, and governors. Alarmingly so, the emergence of convicts and criminals in both the civilian and military domains is becoming a new norm for Russia, as well as every other country that's ever fought a war of this scale. It is one they it's this false moralization that really gets me, that a lot of things
Yeah,
that Russia
yeah,
and even in all fairness Ukraine are doing are what countries have historically done when they are in large scale wars. Is it necessarily morally right? I believe that's a question best answered when everything is said and done, so I hold my tongue for the time being. But this is just the reality of how these kind of wars work in this era. So, I mean, criminals and convicts. Hell, the United States uses criminal and convict battalions as recently as what, Vietnam? Now, we haven't had a war of that scale since to do that, but I mean, I wouldn't put it past any Western government at this point to do that. Now, if that could actually be followed successfully, that's another question. But once again, it's this false moralization. It makes it look like it's an act of desperation when this is just about what any country would do in this position. Regarding military affairs, Russian forces have greatly underperformed Ukraine to such an extent that Moscow's last resort is committing open acts of terrorism as means to push Ukraine to the negotiating table, hoping to use the accompanying ceasefire as an additional operational pause to reinforce its front lines. Now, I don't know what acts they're referring to. Perhaps the strike on civilian infrastructure is what they may be saying, but once again, that's a bit par for the course for modern war. I mean, look, it might be a hard pill to swallow for some, but that's just what happens in these situations. I don't really think you can call attacking vital infrastructure in a nation that you're in an open conflict with really a terroristic act, especially considering some things that you had brought up at the beginning of the show with some of the things I would say are much more justifiably would be called terroristic acts. But in look, Russia's military, we've discussed the question of underperformance. We've discussed the Russian strategy at length. So if you want to know what we really think about that, you can go back through some of our previous episodes. I won't get into it right now. And these examples point to the fact that the current political regime in Moscow is losing stamina, and the country may well be entering a period of internal havoc and serious instability. Thus, it may be the case that Russia's political regime might not survive the current and upcoming challenges. As retired U.S. Lieutenant General Benjamin Hodges has noted, Russia may very well be on its way to deep stagnation and collapse. Hodges also argued that the West's inability to adequately prepare for the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 might have resulted in Russian President Vladimir Putin's advent to power and all the tragedy which has occurred since. The absolute lack of self-awareness in that statement that, I mean, they do admit that because of the West's response to the collapse of the Soviet Union, we are in the position we are today. However, they completely miss everything between that. Rather than realizing, perhaps going in and being a vulture on Russia's carcass, at least what it looked like at the time, perhaps led to a degree of resentment, something that would have prevented further integration and reconciliation between the two poles, the two blocks of power. They make the opposite argument and say we didn't go far enough, we didn't pillage them enough. And just this article,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
you'll pick up on the general tone as I go through more of it, it's more or less justifying every piece of Russian propaganda about how the West wants to just completely demolish and loot the country. And again, this is one of those NGO think tanks that has the ear of politicians and has had the ear of presidential administrations. They consulted for Obama's cabinet, so it's not like this is just a throwaway organization. Now, they're certainly not the most influential, but they have their connections. But to continue, let's see. A similar statement by Mikhailo Podolyak, an advisor to the Ukrainian office of the president, accurately stipulated that there is no need to be afraid of the truth. Russia cannot continue existing in its current form. Russia must lose, be punished for neglecting international law, and undergo a political transformation. So, just to put that in very simple terms, Russia must be the next Germany. And that's something I've often said
Yeah,
before,
yeah.
that if Russia wants to know its future, if it complies with Western demands right now, they can look at Germany. And I mean that wholeheartedly. Indeed, instead of seeking a compromise and negotiating with Putin or his successor in the case of a reshuffle among the Russian elite, the West should increase military, economic, and diplomatic support for Ukraine while making adequate preparations to face a potential collapse of the Russian state in its current form. The primary means of a comprehensive strategy aimed at preempting the rebirth of an aggressive, revanchist, and militaristic Russia must be established. Now, we'll get more into it, but thus far, and I'll give you a hint, you won't see any of this. Nowhere have they made the argument is in the interests of the United States, Europe, or anything vaguely Western to pursue this policy, and these are just the ramblings of a spurned diaspora, which I'm sure shocks none of you. But to continue. First, the West must come to an understanding that Russia, both for its own good and the overall security of Europe, the brazenness of that statement, must lose its war against Ukraine. That is why the West must do the utmost to ensure Ukraine receives all necessary weapons and military equipment, and that Russia's conventional military capabilities are broken. Stephen Blank of Foreign Policy Research Institute claimed in an interview with this author that even more powerful move would be to grant Ukraine NATO membership now, not later, not tomorrow. And once again, I shocked by the brazenness of all of this. It it's a lot to process that somebody had the balls to write this, and it had the it's like I said, zero shame, zero self-awareness in any of this. Second, Western countries need to carefully study and analyze their past mistakes that ultimately led to the rise of Putinism in Russia. Once again,
Yeah.
a negative self-awareness in that statement right there. As argued by Jamestown Foundation senior fellow Paul Gobel, the three fundamental mistakes on the part of the West that led to the emergence of Putin's Russia was, quote, first, the West declared victory, sought peace, dividends, and assumed, quote, history was over. Second, it blocked illustration for its own convenience and in the name of stability, allowing many of the same people to come back to power. And third, it assumed political action was not necessary and that the economics would solve all. The West declared Russia to be a democracy and not focused all its attention on promoting a market economy. That opened the way to authoritarian, even fascist, Putin regime. Along this vein, Blank further stated that we, the West, should support democratic capitalism. Democracy and capitalism are not the same things, but you cannot have democracy without capitalism, and the essence of capitalism is the right to private property. He also added that government under law and support for private enterprise, that is guaranteed laws, were the key preconditions for Russia's transformation in the 1990s. Furthermore, the idea of Russia as an empire, quote, entitled to spirit and influence, unquote, should have been uprooted, but none of these critical actions ever took place because that would have required an outright occupation akin to that of Germany or Japan of a sovereign Russia that had an internal collapse. Now, fueled by external factors, of course, but what they would have proposed would have led to an outright war had they tried to implement these terms on Russia, a nation that collapsed that didn't even have a post-war treaty with. Although, in many ways, it was a post-war treaty. As you look at the Western powers and American officials and Western officials in general were the ones who wrote the first constitution of the Russian Federation, and many of the other post-Soviet republics they advised in the statecraft of that. But to continue on, the third step involved targeting three major destructive forces that have historically been a detrimental impact on Russia itself and the continent jeopardized neighbor security. These forces are a drive towards territorial expansion, incessant militarism and militarization of public sentiments, endemic corruption based on, among other things, Russia's strategic dependency on natural resources, which has not only had an eroding effect on Russia itself, but has also been used by Moscow to promote its interests and agendas abroad. And
Yeah, they're really
it,
concerned about
yeah,
Russia's erosion. They really, really are.
yes,
They really feel it for them. It's so ridiculous, right? It's so ridiculous. Obviously, what the West like what the West dreamed would happen after the fall of the Soviet Union is that Russia, once it got rid of all the other like Soviet states, Russia proper would then balkanize into 5 to 7 different countries, right? The BP and all the oil companies that like paid virtually nothing to get at that oil and gas in the 90s, they would continue forever. Europe would get like super rich, but not get out of line because that could endanger American supremacy over the world.
oh yes,
But
the
America would
balkanized
oversee
Russian resource would be
how that
carefully
relationship would
managed.
develop.
Yeah,
Say that again. I lost you there.
the balkanized Russian resources would be carefully managed by key players in Europe to make sure they stay compliant, to make sure they stay docile. So, more or less,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
if you want to model for,
As we found out in 2022.
oh, absolutely, you want to model for the Russia that they're describing, it is that of Europe today, and probably even a little less because I imagine they would impose much harsher restrictions on Russia and much harsher
Oh yeah.
economic restrictions. It would be once again, and they're brazen in saying it, a Morgantown Plan. And if Russia wants to know its future under these types, look no further than Germany. But to continue on, each of these elements could be addressed through respectively accomplishing a partial decolonization of Russia, implementing a comprehensive demilitarization program, and overseeing a thorough desovietization of the economy, moving away from such a resource dependent system. Now, I know rhetoric is rhetoric and politicians are politicians, but it is rich hearing about desovietization from a block of powers and people who are supporting a Frankenstein states carved out of former Soviet borders, that being Ukraine, as well as ignoring much of the rhetoric that has come out of Russia in the past several years. And in fact, when you look at the speech given on, I believe it was the 23rd or the 24th, either day before or the day of the actual commencement of the military operation, of Putin talking about how this was a crisis created by Soviet ethnic gerrymandering. And once again, take a politician's word for what you will, and rhetoric is rhetoric, but it it's as if they don't even try to make a counterpoint that is believable to the people that they're trying to reach. They claim to be this dissident organization and that they have the best interests of the Russians deep in their heart. But all I see is just all I see is an ethnic bloodlust. But to continue, to end part one here, in the case that
Yeah, yeah, of course.
in the case that Russia loses the war against Ukraine, funny they don't even admit to that being a certainty, and enters a period of severe internal havoc, re-engagement with Moscow in the domains of economics, business, technology, culture, and science must be made conditional on the adoption and implementation of these measures, among others. So, moving on to part two.
Yeah.
A Morgantown Plan for Russia, avoiding post-1991 mistakes with dealing with post-Putin Russia Part 2. As was noted by retired U.S. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, and thoroughly explored by Jamestown Foundation senior fellow Janusz
This is the
Boyaitsky. Go ahead.
same Ben Hodges that thinks Ukraine. Hodges said today that or yesterday rather, that he expects Ukraine to take meat up this year. That's Ben Hodges.
This reminds me of it was one of the Douglas McGregor interviews way back when, or maybe it wasn't Douglas McGregor, maybe it was Scott Ritter. It was somebody who, once again, was a creature of the system that escaped with their mind intact and with any sense of rationality or reason. They made this joke that in the Pentagon, in the deepest levels of the Pentagon, they always had to turn on these sensor waves that would fry everyone's processing power and rationality as they drove into Washington, D.C. for the commute and then turned it off at the end of the day. Which, I mean, just reading stuff like this, reading about Ben Hodges and people like this, just reminds me of that. So, senior fellow Janusz Boyaitsky, in his new book, Failed State, A Guide to Russia's Rupture, Russia may well be on its way towards partial disintegration and the collapse of its current political regime, a process that has been further accelerated by Russia's war of choice against Ukraine, Boyatsky, Failed State 2022. Once again, the framing of it as a war of choice is a bit disingenuous, and we've gone over that at length here. But with the prospect of Russia military defeat in Ukraine quite real, provided that Ukraine receives enough of its requested weaponry, the historic chance to address the issues Russia militarism is presenting itself. And the idea that if Ukraine just gets another $30 billion package, if Zelensky just cries in front of the U.S. Congress one more time, that's how close we are to victory. And that's all in the context of, just keep in mind the battlefield report we did on Ukraine just, 30 minutes ago? Thus, these measures need to be implemented to mitigate and neutralize one of Russia's main destructive forces, its historic drive towards militarism. To begin the process of Russian quote-unquote normalization, through the demilitarization, two conditions must be filled. And I ask, what nation worth its salt today, what nation with any degree of influence doesn't have a historic drive towards militarism? The United States, the UK, France, Germany, China, like any of these. What one of these countries doesn't have a militaristic history? And I mean, once again, I'm arguing as these people are saying this both not disingenuously and also in good faith, so perhaps I'm wasting my own time here, but to continue. First, for its own good and for the sake of its neighbors, once again, Russia must suffer a complete military defeat in its war of aggression against Ukraine. This might result in the current collapse of the political regime, a drastic reduction in Russian conventional military potential. For this, Ukrainian forces must be provided with all necessary equipment, including modern air defense systems, artillery systems, multiple launch rocket systems, battle tanks, armored personnel carriers, fighting vehicles, combat aircraft, and anti-ship missiles in the demanded quantities. Now keep all of that in mind as we move forward and as we get into our European news, because all of that will be sorely lacking, as it already is sorely lacking. Additionally, Ukraine should be granted membership into NATO right away without delay. Luckily, awareness is rising among Western leaders that any quote-unquote diplomatic solution aimed at quote-unquote saving face for Russia, initially backed by many European politicians, will not halt Russia's militarism in the long run. This was recently underscored by NATO Secretary Stoltenberg, among others. On top of that, continued arms supplies must be accommodated by toughening the international isolation of Moscow's current political regime until it is brought to collapse. Introduction of new, while maintaining previously announced, economic sanctions should be added to recognizing Russia first and foremost as a state sponsor of terrorism. A step that has already been taken by the European Parliament, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and NATO Parliamentary Assembly. This must be followed by the recognition of Russia as a terrorist state.
Because Russia is destroying all their generators.
Yeah,
I mean, that's what it comes down to, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know what other.
And they can't even repair them because they've admitted it, that they're based on Soviet systems, and they need this to, like, what happened in the last 30 effing years? Like, how did these people not prepare for this? Yeah, do go on. Do go on.
Okay, because there's so much more of this, and there's honestly so much to say, but I feel like a lot of the points are just repeating themselves, and I think we're all on a bit of consensus here on the conclusions we can draw from this article. But I thought you guys just heard it read out loud from the
Mm-hmm.
show because it's just one of these things that comes along once in a blue moon that just really just needs to be said. They just need to speak for themselves in their own words to understand what's happening here. So the second condition involves the need for a post-war Russia to go through a comprehensive, and this is of critical importance, internationally supervised demilitarization program that consists of the following four initiatives. The legal acknowledgement of Russia's defeat must be clearly spelled out in any post-war peace treaties. The an international a major international tribunal must be carried out to try war criminal key propagandists, pro-war political elites, intellectuals, and representatives of the military-industrial complex responsible for the instigation and outbreak and conducting of war crimes. This, however, will only be a partial measure without massive lustration process, which is needed to tackle the broader layers of Russian society. In doing so, the international community should not be disturbed by the fear of quote-unquote humiliating Russia. Instead, failure in executing these steps will inevitably lead to Russian propaganda twisting the true nature, roots, and results of the war, which could lead to the rebirth of revanchism, militarism, and strengthening of anti-Western sentiments within the country. As if bringing in international occupation force, balkanizing the country, and rewriting its laws would not do that. No anti-Western sentiments to be found there. In this context, Jamestown senior fellow Paul Goebel recently argued that the West should provide tough love rather than weak neglect it practiced after 1991. This means being very demanding in terms of what's politically acceptable, including requiring mass
This is such a ridiculous
lustration.
article. It's like they weren't playing tough in the 90s. What? Like,
Oh,
what is he talking about? I think they were doing all they could, right? But they were always afraid, this is the other country with as many nukes as us. What are you going to do this time?
and I mean, I suppose that's the key question. Unless they're assuming Russian nukes just don't work, what makes them think they would get to this point before bringing nuclear hellfire upon the world? Are they that arrogant, or is this just some sort of mental masturbation? Pardon my French here. For oh,
Well, I mean, I think there's certain tropes that they want to develop here, right? The Russians are not civilized, the Americans are. Russia is a colonial power. America is too woke to still be colonial, even though it's colonial, right? Like one of the reasons why the woke agenda is something that America has to absolutely be married to is because it desires to be the world empire. That is its desire post-Soviet Union. Even if it has to go into retreat, it will not relinquish that desire,
look, I
right?
know it is
even if it's
cliche.
even if it's no longer mostly white, it believes in this cause,
I know it's
right?
cliche, but neoconservatism and just American foreign policy, it really is just Trotskyism. Like that is what this reads like. This reads like the screams
Yeah.
of spurned Jewish revolutionaries, for really lack of a better word, who are mad that who are still bitter about certain events in 1905 and so on. So continuing on, this means being very demanding in terms of what's politically acceptable, including require massive lustration, international supervision of elections, and supportive to agree not since the Marshall Plan of the 1940s. As they call this article, the Morgantown Plan for Russia, mind you.
It's really quite something.
Number
It's
two,
really quite.
Russia must be held economically liable for the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine. You mean like they will be in the case of victory as well? So what's their point here? That it's bad that Russia plans on rebuilding Ukraine, but we're going to make Russia rebuild Ukraine under our terms. Is more or less what this is.
They've already like rebuilt like almost half of Mariupol, so
Oh,
like, like, you're not rebuilding the way we want you to rebuild it. Like, what's your
where are the
problem?
pride flags, Pootler? Where are the pride
Yeah, where are
flags?
the pride flags?
Well, I almost had a little bit of a slip there. As
Oh,
Ukraine,
actually, Russia is has their first case of somebody who is being
yeah, charged
sued.
under the anti-LGBTQIA propaganda laws. The first time in like 10 years they're finally actually enforcing it.
Yeah, his name is Keenstein. Is his last name?
Whew. Yeah, I bet
Wow.
he's just a Volga German, nothing more to look
Yeah.
at. Yeah, yeah. But with that being said, Zelensky noted back in early March 2022 that Russia should start learning the meaning of the words reparations and indemnities. Zelensky is as strong and powerful as a black woman who works too hard. I'll just put it that way. You know what? Slay Queen. In interviews with this author, Boyaisky and the prominent Russian expert in Jamestown analysis, Stephen Blank, agreed that Russia must be held responsible for the compensation of material losses suffered by Ukraine. In the case that a lack of financial compensation, Russia's vast natural resources should be used as a substitute. So once again, gives me that is really all you can say.
Yes,
And
because they know now it's going to be very hard for America to take care of Europe.
oh,
If they
absolutely.
and if they don't, they'll lose Europe, right? So this is what I mean. Like, I mean, this war's not over. It may not be over for a very long time. A new war could start. I think, like, you're hearing all this talk about uh, we're going to donate a token amount of tanks. The British have said that. Schultz has gone back and forth. Uh, Macron has already given them their wheeled tanks, the light tanks, which is kind of a smart move because he's like, well, I gave the first tanks, like who's going to follow? But this is their creep, right? They're trying to normalize the idea that eventually NATO or some kind of NATO forces in an unofficial capacity, maybe an official one later on, are going to have to enter Ukraine. That's the direction it seems things are going right now.
And also, that last sentence just really sums all of it up, doesn't it? Because, I mean, look, you look at the root of this war, it was to solidify a divorce between Russia and Europe. And if Russia comes out somewhat on top of this war, not that bad blood will be gone, not that relations will be fully restored, but there will be some sort of renormalization just because of sheer pragmatism. They will need the resources from Russia. So, what the United States is looking at, what Washington is looking at, what the people in charge of the empire are looking at, is that the only way to stop Europe from defecting is we keep them under the boot
Yep.
for now, and then once we break up Russia, we can carefully curate who gets the resources and what, and that gives us once again more power to
Yes.
micromanage Europe, which has always been the goal all along since the end of the Cold War, because they knew not necessarily that Europe is valuable to the interests of the American empire, but the interest comes to depriving Europe of cooperation with other blocs. That's what it's always been about. That's what it's been about since at least 1991, if not further. And I mean, I think that's really exemplified in the demolition of Nord Stream and the attempted sabotage in the other pipelines. But to continue on with point three here. The international community must make sure the ongoing indoctrination, mass militarization of the Russian youth is stopped. And the results of this process need to be reversed. Initiate en masse after 2014. Russia's aggressive push to militarize its youth, both domestically and in occupied areas of Ukraine, blah 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 citation, is seemingly reached its zenith. Currently, Russian authorities are hastily including information about the so-called special military operation in school textbooks, aiming to proliferate and strengthen anti-Ukrainian, anti-Western sentiments among Russian youth on a grassroots level. Judging by the example of Russia, by and large unsuccessful post-1991 transformation, at a time when the core of Russian society was compromised of Soviet-born and indoctrinated individuals, it is safe to say the indoctrinated young Russians have been subject to severe psychological trauma that they would not find at Drag Queen Story Hour, by the way, that will have lasting impact on both the minds and outlook of young Russians for many years to come. And I just want to say something about this. What nation, what people does not indoctrinate its youth? And
Yeah.
look, this may sound, for some of you who may not be used to this kind of rhetoric, but youth are there. You need to enculturate them in something. Like, you need to imprint something on them because they are children. They're learning the world. And if you're a nation, if you're a religion, if you're whatever, you need, and it is in your own interest, and frankly, their interest as part of that body, to instill these values in them. And this is the basis for how nations and societies function, that you teach children from a young age, this is just how things work. Now, of course, yes, there's room for change, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes things don't work, and sometimes things need to be rectified. Anyone with an IQ above 85 understands that. Now, unfortunately, I don't think that's many of the people who are both writing and reading this article, but I'll put that aside for now. But Systems self-perpetuate. Stability is built on the quote-unquote indoctrination of youth all across the world. Now,
Yeah.
some systems are better than others, some values are better than others, admittedly, but the idea that, once again, it's this false neutrality propagated by liberalism. We just need to eliminate blah blah blah, which means, of course, letting us take control of that. Now, I know pointing at hypocrisy is practically meaningless, but this is what they're getting at. The false neutrality of liberalism always favors the people who are willing to break the taboo first, in which case, we're reading their article. But getting back on track with this, uh, therefore, it will be essential to launch a massive program of de-Sovietization targeting the myths and delusions coming from the Soviet period of Russian history, factors that have heavily contributed to the outbreak of Moscow's current war of aggression against Ukraine. Wow, that's revolutionary rhetoric. I've never heard that before. Implementation of military-related measures are needed that would make the reemergence of aggressive Russian militarism and expansionism highly unlikely, in addition to comprehensive demilitarization program, which would ideally culminate in the elimination of Russia's nuclear weapons and the prohibition of their future development. A system of regional treaties and alliances should be established with the states of Central Eastern Europe, in addition to those that already exist. As argued by Buyaisky, Poland and Ukraine can form the core of a regional initiative that will focus on common security, economic development, infrastructural connectivity, in close coordination with the US and NATO. The exact format can be decided by all states that seek inclusion, for example, Estonia, Latvia, Poland, Lithuania, Czechia, Slovakia, and Romania, once again, and at least with, Slovakia and Romania and some of these other nations, the idea that they're completely on board with this Polish fantasy of the intermarium state, the intermarium alliance. It has been a pipe dream of the Poles for a number of years now, and the fact that it's still taken seriously by anyone, even these kind of people, is, I really have no words for that. But it could involve a regional version of mutual defense in case of being attacked by NATO model. Belarus, Moldova, Bulgaria, and Hungary can also become involved in some of the regional formats, and that makes you want. Yeah, it's interesting that they bring up Hungary because that's presumably after a post-regime change Hungary. Now, they don't mention anything about Orban in this article, but I can't imagine that they have too favorable a view of somebody like Viktor Orban. Um,
Well, as usual, they're the thing with these articles, right, is they always skip way ahead. And I don't mean they ignore the war that would be necessary to get to this point, because of course they have to do that. They have to elaborate on diplomatic, economic, and political instruments in order to achieve these results, right? But the other reason uh, they go on and on about this, well, there's actually two reasons. One is to reinforce the idea subconsciously that only America is the proper arbiter of the world of how a country ought to be, right? Number two is they don't want to tell you that ultimately, because there are other think tanks besides this one uh, that were published in 2022 outlining and even before 2022, but no one can play ignorant in 2022 and 2023. Um, that there were always plans to balkanize Russia, right? Just ipso facto, right?
just
Um,
remember, everything these
and
people
so they
call a
have to,
conspiracy theory or whatever is something that they've published already in their own words, like what we're
mhm,
reading right now.
right. So that's why they they have to make it palatable for the politicians and the midwits who are going to be reading this.
Oh, I just want you to imagine how much this gets filtered down. So, the think tank people put these things out, which get forwarded to the congressional staffers, which get forwarded to the actual members of Congress and the policymakers who will be looking at this. And so imagine how many layers of watering down there is before it actually reaches somebody who can actually sign off on a decision of importance. So on top of the drivel right here, imagine that just mixed in with a bunch of other just complete nonsense as it becomes a giant game of telephone from the think tanks to the people who are actually in charge of making decisions. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. So to finish this point here, uh, The purpose would not only be the deterrence of potential Russian revanchism, but also an effective format of enhancing regional cooperation and economic growth. Several existing initiatives, such as the Three Seasons Initiative, there it is, can thereby be significantly developed. That's pipe dream, and it's probably one of the biggest pipe dreams in the world right now. And I don't know why this idea still perpetuates. I think it's some sort of really just romanticism out of like places like Poland and Lithuania that they can form this great bloc. But I'll hold my tongue on that for the time being, and because we're almost at the end of it, we're starting part 3 right now. So a Morgantown Plan for Russia, avoiding post 1991 mistakes and dealing with post Putin Russia part 3, blah blah blah. In part 2, specific steps and initiatives were discussed that would constrain Russia's military potential and mitigate militarism. See part 2. Here are two other essential issues that will be addressed to constrain Russian imperialism and how to transform Moscow's resource based and deeply corrupt economy. Moscow is famously the only country in the world with a deeply corrupt economy. Oligarchy,
Okay.
concentrated wealth, that exists nowhere in the world, and it's a recipe for economic dysfunction, as if that hasn't been the economic model since economies were even formed in the first place. But we'll just override all of that. And once again, that's not to say like Russia's economy doesn't have a problem. It obviously does, but all
If the corruption were this bad, Russia would have stopped this war by now.
oh,
Too
absolutely.
many people to be bought off.
Yeah, I
Sorry.
mean it's the framing of these issues as uniquely Russian that always bothers me. Is like as if this
Yeah.
and they do this to countries. And look, I of course have a somewhat positive opinion of Russia, as I'm sure many of you have gathered at this point. But even China, a country that I really don't have any strong feeling towards, like they'll also portray them as like this uniquely broken country as well. And they do this all around the world. They'll do it for Hungary. They'll do it to any country that is currently feuding with the international order, as if these problems are uniquely that. And look, I obviously know the agenda at hand, but it's just one of those things that bothers me on a visceral level because it's so deceitful. Because and I think that's what this Trotskyist, this neoconservative, whatever you want to call it, this liberal form of imperialism is like. Because when you had actual empires, there was an understanding that empires will do what they must in order to perpetuate and expand themselves. But it's this. Maybe it's the lack of honesty that really bothers me. But I mean, to expect honesty from these people is a fool's errand. So I won't even begin to try. So to begin with, terms of constraining Russia's imperial drive, two primary goals should be pursued. The first maximalist goal is complete decolonization and partition of the Russian Federation along ethno-religious lines. There it is.
Oh wow.
To,
Yeah.
to some extent,
Let's put this into perspective. So about 84 to 85% of Russia is Russian. It's Slavic. Their biggest minority are um I forget the name of it. They only make up like 5%. It's like when people go on and on about China, it's really diverse. And it's like what you're looking at is basically what if Europe was a giant state and 65% of it was one nationality, and the other 28 countries, they can be whatever, 1%, 3%, 2%, right? Russia's very much in the same boat. And the vast majority of these populations, they are literally at like 1 or 2 or 3% of the
well, I'm
population.
actually glad you brought that up because that brings me to my next point. So, as you said, when it comes to Russian or even Slavic, they're a super
Tartars, that's the
yes.
biggest one, and it's 5%. Ooh.
They are a super majority in the country. They have the regions that are majority minority, so to speak, economically and militarily tied to the Russian Federation. And they'll also cite a lot of these things. They'll cite like how these different oblasts and these different republics within the Russian Federation have these names. But once again, that is a Soviet leftover because every people needed an established republic to be considered people by the Soviet Union. So again, you might have. I mean, let's take the formerly Jewish autonomous oblast, as it were, under the Soviet Union, that little speck land outside of Siberia to give the Jewish people of the Soviet Union a nation. Well, the majority ethnic group in that is Russian. You go down to somewhere like Dagestan, it nobody has a majority there, but I think it actually is plurality Russian. Correct me if I'm wrong. But point being is, in terms of like ethnic minority rights, there hasn't really been a movement since the Chechens when it comes to secession, and they've been fully assimilated into the Russian state structure. As we've seen, especially with this war, they've been unabashedly pro-Russian. Now, there have been elements here and there that have fought for Ukraine since 2014 onwards, blah, blah, blah. But point being is, Russia is, ironically enough, to agree with them, an imperial state. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, though. But these groups, again, they're handfuls compared to the amount of ethnic Russians. And any secessionist desires that even exist are just completely unviable. There is no economic or military basis for any of that because, once again, if they don't have them tied into the system of the Russian Federation, I mean, and think about how many of these groups are just like out in the rural, desolate Far East. Are you going to form a new nation, a new republic out of this chunk of Siberia? Is that, I mean, that is the plan ultimately, just to at least fracture Russia. But in terms of some sort of like ethno-religious or like ethno-nationalist uprising all the Russian minorities, it's been a fantasy that's like been perpetuated for years. I mean, the Russian Empire had far worse demographics. The Soviet Union had far worse demographics, and you still didn't see that scenario play out. I mean, of course, the Russian Empire did collapse, the Soviet Union did collapse, but it wasn't the absolute collapse that they would have desired. So, just to delve a little bit in that before moving on and to continue with that, to some extent, this scenario is comparable with the 1944 suggested post-surrender program for Germany, better known as the Morgantown Plan. There it is. There it is. As was theorized by longtime Eurasia expert and Jamestown Foundation analyst Paul Goebel, in this case, Russia begins to fragment. We must also make distinctions among parts that emerge. Trying to hold together will not only work, but will alienate people on the ground. Many forget that there are those still angry that the United States was the 37th country to recognize the de facto Baltic independence, and that the United States spoke against Ukrainian independence in August, only to take credit for everything in December. And I believe that regionalism will be the nationalism of the next Russian revolutionary collapse. I suspect that there will emerge a variety of entities, more than half of which will now be labeled predominantly Russian. Some will form confederacies, even federations, but disintegration will must precede reintegration. Promoting reintegration now is a recipe for an even more chaotic future. So,
Yeah, for you, not for
yes,
Russia.
yes, and once again, even according to Western polling firms, same Western polling firms that tell us that, yeah, Putin has, what, a 75, 70% approval rating, and once again, those come from sources that would actually have a vested interest in downplaying that, even reporting that high. But what are the sentiments for pro-independence in the eastern regions of Russia? I know there's movements that exist here and there, but in terms of any actual secessionist movement in Russia, what exists right now? I cannot name a single one. Now, admittedly, I should say, I cannot name a single one that actually is viable. Is there any? Please correct me if I'm wrong, but
I'll give you an example from my own life. Um, for all intents and purposes, in Canada, there was a secessionist movement from Quebec, and we had two elections on that. That is a serious secessionist movement, right? Where votes are cast, no one knows for sure what's going to happen, right? There is nothing remotely like that in Russia.
Scottish independence is more serious than any secessionist movement in Russia.
Exactly. Uh, Scottish independence is more likely than any, Siberian oblast that's going to break away from Russia. Okay, I mean, this is foolish, and this is why they need to perpetuate this war for as long as possible, right? Um, the real test will come, I think, in the next few weeks, because let's say Solidar is taken, that's it. Okay, for all intents and purposes, 80% of that place is gone. The Russians control it. They've taken over the administrative building. All of central Solidar has been taken over. They're sitting on hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers that will have to decide what they want to do. Uh, they were given a due time that by midnight they will have to decide. So what happens after that with Bakhmut? There are still another 145,000 troops that are supposed to come on board, right, in the next coming weeks and months. Um, what is going to happen after that, right?
And keep in mind,
You know
although
that they're
that's
going
all
to
that's
begin
announced
to
right now.
panic when it looks like Ukraine is going to collapse, right?
Oh yeah,
And they've invested so much money. Like America's literally invested $100 billion in 10 months, 11 months. Um,
more than the country of Ukraine is worth as an entirety.
yeah,
It has been completely propping up its economy, keeping it from economic and social collapse. And keep in mind with those Russian figures in terms of troops that are supposed to arrive, just because it's 125K now, they certainly have the potential to activate and move more reservists
yeah.
or other troops as needed. So,
I think the Russians have always known that Ukraine is probably just the first war.
oh, absolutely. And I will be surprised if by the end of this year we do not see major action out of somewhere like Kazakhstan, the Caucasus, or even Belarus. And those are the three I would assume, but there will, and I'm saying 90% sure, will be a second front opened up in this general
Or
Western
Western
Russia
Ukraine
war.
and Kosovo, something along those lines. They will get very desperate. I mean, Zelensky is offering Snake Island to Romania now.
As he
Well, why
should.
is he doing that? I thought it was Ukrainian territory
as,
because
as he should, number one,
because
but
he knows it's slipping, right? He knows like things are not good right now.
yeah, and I mean, you can tell just by his demeanor in Congress and the act that he puts on. Once again, the momentum that could have seen at least a stalemate, which would be somewhat in Ukraine's favor, that existed from August, September, October, has quickly evaporated. You had some of the concessions in November with the Kherson Clown Show to bring back an old favorite title. And then December, both figuratively and literally, froze over. And now in the opening days of January, again, we're about a third of the way through January, we're seeing substantial action taken by the Russians right now, which, if this continues on the current trajectory, a lot of the initial predictions going into the winter will probably pan out. So, but I mean, then there's also, I mean, there's of course several other questions which we'll get into later in the show, but for the time being, now of course something could change. You could see one of those second or third fronts open up relatively soon, but if things continue on the current trajectory, things are looking a lot more favorable for Russia than they've looked in about 10 months.
They've already started mining the outskirts of Kiev. They're setting up bunkers. I saw some videos and footage today.
Man,
Like they're
that's
afraid of Kiev getting invaded.
yeah, and they were moving troops along the Belarusian border, expecting that Russian buildup in Belarus would be used for that. But to continue, because we're actually almost done with the article here. In the same vein, Jamestown senior fellow Janusz Boyatsky added that the only reason the 83 Federal Republic can decide on the status, only the residents of the 83 federal units can decide on the status of their administrative territories. Western governments cannot break up Russia. They can only make the process as peaceful as possible by offering diplomatic and economic assistance and mediation where conflicts materialize between certain regions and republics. So, the West can't directly break up Russia, but they can incite the breakup of Russia from the inside, is what more or less that is. Washington and
Yeah, yeah.
Brussels should
Like
also coordinate close.
literally a 200-year-old project.
Oh, I mean, longer than that, but point stands. Washington and Brussels should also coordinate closely with all the countries bordering Russia that will be affected by its impending rupture, whether through conflict spillover, refugee outflow, protection of ethnic or religious kindred, or managing latent territorial claims. Planning should begin now to establish an international coordination committee to manage Russia's dissolution by setting an agenda for all the envisated scenarios and minimizing the risk of armed conflict, which is, I mean,
Oh yeah,
that's a
they literally want armed
yeah,
conflict
exactly.
because that's what it would take.
That said, however, successful accomplishment of such a plan is highly unlikely. Oh, there it is. As war against Ukraine, among other international crimes committed by Russia, have vividly demonstrated, the Kremlin still has prominent apologists and task supporters in Western political intellectual circles, otherwise known as pragmatists. Second, the minimalist goal, if Russia does not fragment or disintegrate completely, would be ensure a looser confederation type administrative political structure in Russia. In this scenario, the federal center would not be to exercise unlimited and unconditional control over the other border and ethnically non-Russian regions, as noted by Buyatsky. Supporting genuine federalism and decentralization inside Russia and the rights of the national republics, as well as sovereign regions to secede and establish international relations, should be ensured. From his side, Jamestown President Glenn Howard noted that the U.S. should monitor the situation. There it is again. I wonder if they're going to bring back Trump to get into this project and assess whether new states may emerge, if any at all, as fragmentations become increasingly unavoidable as a rupture occurs inside Russia, preventing Moscow from exerting control over the periphery. Regions like Dagestan and the North Caucasus may become new independent statelets. They use the word they use the word statelets in the article.
That's pretty cynical.
Oh,
Statelets.
well, man, I did. Look, I read through this article yesterday, but I forgot to put statelets in there. Or become part of the North Caucasus Federation, similar to 1919-1920. You know, it's a good sign when they're citing these states that lasted no more than a year after the collapse of the Russian Empire at the end of World War One. You know, that's the plan for regional stability when they bring that up. So within this minimalist goal, yeah, minimalist, okay.
That's minimalist.
Yeah. 3 additional initiatives must be completed. First, Russia's western border region, stretching from the north in the Murmansk Oblast and the south in Krasnodar Krai, must be completely demilitarized. Additionally, prohibition of remilitarization in any form must be imposed in Russia. Perhaps it would be prudent to establish a permanent military monitoring mission that could supervise and implement this goal. Second, the Arctic region and the North Sea route in particular must be turned into a completely demilitarized, denuclearized, and internationally accessible area. Third, in addition to legally annexed parts of Ukraine, as well as Georgia, Moldova, Kaliningrad Oblast, must be taken away from Russia to ensure the impossibility of re-emergence of a Russian military bastion in the center of Europe. As noted by Gobel, Kaliningrad Oblast will be divided up between Lithuania and Poland. Restoring German influence be counterproductive in the extreme. There it is.
How old is this guy writing this?
We can't have a German reemergence. I mean, look, I'll be honest. Historically, I think the Germans have been a malign influence on Europe. When it comes to the France-German rivalry throughout the past 1,000 years of history of Europe, more often than not, I find myself more sympathetic with the French. Full disclosure. But once again coming out and saying that we want to cripple Germany, we want to see that they will never be a power again. This historical territory of theirs, which once again is completely ethnic Russian as is today, the idea of it ever becoming German or anything else other than Russian at this point is completely absurd. But the idea that Germany can't have Kaliningrad back and that it has to be yet another German territorial concession to Poland on top of however much land they gave them before is, I mean, that just tells you how
Well,
friends
this guy
get
writing
treated.
this, I think his name is Janusz, right? Janusz?
Yeah, Janusz, like, Bulyatsky is, he's not the author, but he's the senior fellow that's constantly referenced, so Polish as hell, so... Yeah. The author has some sort of vaguely Eastern Slavic name that I can't quite pin down. So whether he's a Ukrainian or a Russian dissident, that's anyone's guess. But that's the idea that he keeps referencing like these Polish guys. I mean that just says it all, doesn't it? And that, I mean, just keep in mind this is how quote unquote friends of the international order get treated, as I'm sure we've driven home many times. But to finally finish off this interesting article, we do have this last little here. On a different note regarding the Oblast's future, Bulashki stipulated that the residents of Kaliningrad will need to decide whether their interests are best served by remaining a province of a declining and unstable Russian state, or whether sovereignty and independence together with closer ties with the European Union would better ensure security and economic growth. Western governments should underscore that Kaliningrad and all Russian regions must face a stark choice between international isolation or cooperation and the sanctions that can be avoided by distancing themselves from Moscow, its imperial wars, and anti-Western policies. And let me just stipulate that with my own stipulation that Kaliningrad is the most militarized region of Russia, and the people who live there, again, are almost all completely military. And they are, once again, they are that spearhead of Russia. These are the people who will push the red button before they let Kaliningrad fall. So, unless they plan on mass deportations from Kaliningrad, I don't really know what's the game here. But regarding Russia in the economic domain, the following steps should be taken, which aim to reduce the Kremlin's current ability to wage war against Ukraine and allow the country to rebuild its post-war economy while avoiding the prospect of being trapped in strategic dependency on raw resources. Number one, a price cap on Russia's natural resources in general and non-renewable energy in particular would have the most effective solution and must be introduced in this regard. It must be introduced. In this regard, Poland and the Baltic states have already proposed a price cap of $30 USD per barrel on petroleum. Ideally, a full ban on Russian energy resources should be imposed. Once again, not only implementing the Morgantown Plan on Russia, but on the entirety of Europe as well. Meanwhile, other oil and gas producers should strengthen their efforts, replacing Russia as a primary supplier. The international community must ensure that quote-unquote parallel imports channels are served. Harsher economic sanctions against violators must also be introduced. Supplies of microelectronics and other sensitive technologies to Russia must be cut off until the end of the war and only resume provided that they are not used for military purposes. In general, scientific collaboration, especially in high-tech and sensitive industries, must be limited to civilian purpose only, with such collaboration resuming only after the end of the war and the implementation of all previous conditions. Following the end of the war, Ukraine and the fulfillment of all key conditions, Russia, in whatever territorial form it may take, must be given a chance to re-embark on a path towards normalization. For this to succeed, Russia must combine adoption of the rule of law with free market capitalism, both of which are unthinkable without a strong class of property and business owners, as well as entrepreneurs who have abandoned the ideas of collectivism and blind reliance on the Russian state. The end. So, my
Wow.
friend,
Wow.
would you like to give me your general thoughts on that
Yeah.
on that interesting piece we just read?
So, I mean, this article is completely all over the place. He's talking about balkanization, but also reintegration. So why would he want? Oh, of course, because the Sakha and the Nenets are like going to become this incredible force that cannot be given too much independence because they'll have to be, and that's why they'll have to be reintegrated into a new Russia, right? Of course, run by Westerners, not by Russians, or run by Poles and Lithuanians, but not by Russians. I mean, it's insane. The war, first of all, isn't over. I guess he presumes that this is going to be a cakewalk for the West, right? And they will eventually win this war. Um, I know that that the elites in the West are trying to slow walk um, the European public as well as the American and Canadian public into a larger war, or at least a very a much longer war. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen. Uh, there's some details about this that I love so much, like sell Russian gas for $30 a barrel, like as if like the rest of the oil producing countries are going to go along with it, because they already did, right? They're not. They're not going to go along with it. Um, I, I asked how old this guy was because to me he sounds like he's very old and he's not really in tune. If he's young, then he's like completely brainwashed, or he knows how to word an essay like this in such a way that it becomes appealing for like less intelligent politicians and midwits. Um, I mean, I've heard this kind of rhetoric many, many, many times over the years from different authors, from different, mm, uh, people, let's say with CSIS or the Atlantic Council or the IMF. So where they've had guest speakers, but not necessarily like the IMF itself. But um, I mean, they're trying to make a rosy picture. Does he not understand that like there are some like Western media that is not being allowed into Russia as a tit for tat for all the Russian media that was banned in Europe and in the US and the Anglosphere? Does he not understand that? Um, and like, I mean, there's even articles by The Economist that are saying in 2022, like their headline is literally the Russians kept their economy a show on the road. Yeah, because they made more money in 2022 than in 2021, right? Like the split in the world has already happened, right? The Saudis are not on your side. There's a lot of countries that are not on your side. India is not on your side. China's not on your side. These are the two biggest economies on that side, on the other side of the world. Like they're not on your side. Um, which means for the West, like the only way out of this situation is escalation. Like they will have to like create a new war somewhere else. It could be Kaliningrad. It could be moving Polish troops, but this time not wearing Ukrainian uniforms, uh, into Western Ukraine, maybe Central Ukraine, right? It all depends on how badly they panic, because as of now, the diet that a lot of Westerners have been having about Russia and Ukraine is Russia is losing, Russia's economy is in trouble. This, Putin's popularity. He's crazy. He's losing his none of those things
He's
are
on
true.
death's door. He has Parkinson's. He fell down a flight of stairs. He pooped himself. All these things that they're spouting, and just like this most blatant war propaganda that's being
Yeah,
fed, and that I wouldn't say majority, but enough Westerners are believing for it to keep going along.
yeah. I mean, they want to believe it, right? Because it's a question of faith in a civilization that is declining. The faith in institutions, which is very ephemeral. Evola talks about this, increases. Like you talk to a Westerner about, okay, how are you going to solve global warming? Um, you know, like there aren't going to be enough electric cars, and they'll say, well, we don't know. It's just going to happen because our scientists said this, and uh, so there's this kind of blind belief, or whether it's the coof. There's just this blind belief in the institutions, right? Because eventually, in a civilization, the religious body is replaced by the secular body, which governs the society. One castle overcomes all the other castles within that society, and it decides on like what the belief system ought to be. So, I mean, in many ways, this article is interesting in the things that it avoids saying or is ignorant of. Maybe the biggest takeaway for me is that um, they have to paint this rosy picture of a possible future, because if Europe doesn't get that gas and get it really cheap really soon, right, that's going to be a bad day for the U.S. Because the U.S., I mean, if anything, the U.S. is getting more isolated, right? Um, China's economy is back up again, and even the economist saying it's going to be the biggest story of 2023. So I don't know what this guy is talking about. Like, they've had all this time to do this. There were no mistakes that were done in 1990. The West did not make mistakes. The West simply could not do what it wanted to do. everything it did from the expansion of NATO, right? And it's a projection to claim that Russia has imperialist ambitions because it's the U.S. who has imperial ambitions vis-a-vis its dollar and NATO, right? That is it. Um, so those are some of the points that come to my mind reading this. I just wanted to clarify something from the beginning of the show when it talked about the lead up to the attack on on the Russian barracks in Makiivka, and I mentioned the slaughter of the family. I found the article written by Patrick Lancaster. It was actually from the 26th of December, and I'll just read it to you. It's very short. Local Russian authorities in Russian-controlled Makiivka are in search of a group of armed men that shot a family of 8 people with machine guns. All were shot in the head. Among those were 3 children, 1, 7, and 9. The 1-year-old child was shot point blank in the head. The gunman left in a Skoda Superb, blue license plate E749 UK. These guys are like, they're Ukrainian nationalists, right? Like that's who these guys are, right? And it literally happened in the town 4 days earlier when the barracks was attacked, right? The other thing is there was an article in the Daily Mail about the CIA behind a spat of explosions in Russia. I have no doubt that there are sleeper cells in Russia right now that are working with the CIA to do this, or with the Pentagon, right? And I have no doubt that the second attack on the Engels Air Force Base is connected with that. Um, the the other thing I wanted to clarify was that town in western Ukraine. Uh, Remember, I told you it was the 8th Regiment that was attacked. Um, so I have the correct spelling of it here. If you'll just give me 1 second, I'm sorry. Oh, the other crazy thing is the Ukrainians are printing a Bible with the blood of the guys that were in Azovstal. With also, there's a petition in Kiev
Wasn't that the kind of thing
call,
that they mocked Saddam Hussein for?
to recognize Biden as a saint, and the first child in Ukraine named Joe Biden has been named. Just, I mean, the other thing. So remember, I told you about the coordinates. So in Moscow, they're publishing coordinates of military bases. They're just a blank piece of paper with longitudinal coordinates and a picture of an explosion. Yeah, so it's Khmelnytsky is the town, and even so it looks like the generator was attacked, but there was also a military facility, and 18 to 13 vehicles in a warehouse were damaged, and this is local authorities have said this. So that's what I wanted to clarify.
Okay, and like I'd say, I think you put it eloquently with the article that this is somebody who is far from out of the times, who really couldn't decide narrative. It does feel like a committee of about 5 or 6 different people wrote this and had their own approach on the situation in general. And again, I've heard all these takes regurgitated, but I've never heard them all together, which is why I found it so noteworthy, and I thought it was worthy to do a full read through on the show. And you know how rarely I do that, so that is how
Mm-hmm.
much that this thing caught my attention. But if you have any further thoughts on any of that, go ahead. But if not, I have plenty of European news to pick away at.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I agree with you actually that it looks like it's several viewpoints that we've heard before all conglomerate together into this one superb article. Um, yeah, I mean it's the dream. This is how good it could be if we just keep funding Ukraine, and if Russia collapses, just trust me, it's going to be awesome. China will change its mind. Just hold on. It reminds me of that guy. What's his name? Zihan or Zelan?
Yeah,
Like
Zihan, who,
Zihan, yeah.
yeah,
He
he,
goes, China's going to collapse by 2030, and it's like 10 years ago. He literally said China's going to collapse. He literally said it in 2012. So like this guy's always saying China's
yeah.
going to collapse.
I'm
It's
really,
it's
I'm really
it's just
curious to see about Zihan, what he tells his people that he is actually paid to consult for, versus what he tells the general public, because I feel like those are very different images he has.
yeah. I mean,
And
Russia, even according to the IMF, Russia is now the ninth largest economy. Like, like I don't know what these guys are even talking about.
Oh no, I mean it may not be in the traditional conventional way that they would have accepted under the basis of the New World Order, and I use that term completely neutrally. I'm not like referring to any like specific
Mhm.
organization, but I should say the post-war order. But it has managed to scrape its way there in a very unconventional method, but you can't really argue with results. But the first European story I wanted to start with was there was a survey put out by an institute called Globsec, which is an NGO based out of Bratislava, Slovakia, and it's, of course, along these lines. But it was interesting because it was a survey on who they believe is responsible. Actually, two surveys were put out. One is how the Visegrad nations feel about Ukrainian refugees, and one is how the Visegrad nations feel about who is most culpable for the war. So, starting with the refugees, out of the surveyed populations, 85% of Poles said it was a positive thing, versus 11% saying it was negative. Hungarians said they took an 82% positive view versus a 15% negative view. Although I do have some questions about the Hungarians, how many of those Ukrainian nationals were of an ethnic Hungarian background, because there has been issues with the language minority laws that we'll get into in a bit here. The Czech Republic had a 73% positive view with a 25% negative view, and Slovakia is the only country that had more negative than positive, with 42% at positive and 52% at negative. Now, who's culpable, most culpable for the war in Ukraine? According to Poland, 84% say Russian out of the surveyed population, 1% say Ukraine, 3% say the US and NATO, and 12% are undecided. In Hungary, the figures look much different. So, 43% in Hungary say Russia, 9% in Hungary say Ukraine, 27% say the US and NATO, and 21% are undecided. In the Czech Republic, it's much more like Poland, where 72% blame Russia, 5% blame Ukraine, 13% blame the US and NATO, and 10% are undecided. Now, Slovakia is where it gets interesting. Slovakia, only 43% blame Russia, which is about on par with Hungary, 7% blame Ukraine, 39% blame the US and NATO, and 11% are undecided. So if you actually calculate this, if you do a little math and you add the totals on Slovakia with blame for NATO and blame for Ukraine, you get a plurality of 46% of people saying Russia is not directly responsible for the war, that they're not the most aggressive party in this war, which, again, with some of the news we'll have out of Slovakia, I thought was interesting how they're becoming a more constant source of distant opinions. Now, in terms of European Union nations, they've always been less harsh on Russia than the rest, with Hungary as well. And once again, you look at Hungary, you add it together. There's a lot of undecided percentage, and I imagine that if it weren't for the situations with the ethnic Hungarians in Ukraine, sympathy towards Ukraine would probably be quite a bit higher in somewhere like Hungary. But I think that soured a lot of them, even with the position of Orban's government being pretty decidedly neutral in the war and pro continuing relations with Russia as they were. But I thought those were interesting figures out of both Hungary and Slovakia in particular. And that continues on with Hungary has come out and they've made some statements about Ukraine's law on minorities. And just to get some of the statements that were specifically made by Orban and others, and taking a look here, and let's see. Here we are. So, statements by and a Hungarian government official said, "It is regrettable that Ukraine continues to diminish the rights of ethnic minorities, including Hungarian communities." That was put out in an official statement. And on top of that, just more news out of Hungary. Viktor Orban was the only European head of state or head of government or former head of government to have received well wishes from Putin in the occasion of Christmas and New Year's. So he's in a special club along with Gerhard Schroeder, former Chancellor of Germany, and Silvio Berlusconi, former Prime Minister of Italy, which I think those two figures shouldn't shock anyone with that. And then to continue on with some of the statements that Orban said, he said, and this is a really groundbreaking statement by Orban, nobody else has come to this conclusion, that the Ukrainian war effort is entirely reliant on support from the US and NATO. Once again, calling that out, and he's also calling into question the viability of continued support, and said that Hungary's support will continue to be stymied by the situation regarding the status of ethnic minorities, particularly Hungarians, in Ukraine. So that has become a real sticking point. Now, how much of that will actually be moved versus how much of that is just a convenient cover not to go along with what the American empire wants? I think it's a bit parts of both, and I could see a situation where Hungary's position might soften up if, say, there was an exemption made for Hungarians or blah blah blah, or the laws were loosened slightly, whereas they might be a modicum more pro-Ukraine, but just because of Hungary's raw self-interest at this point and its energy cooperation, economic cooperation with Russia, I don't see them turncoating in if there's any event short of a regime change. I'll put it that way. And
Hmm.
to continue on with our European news, you have Croatia, who is set to adopt the euro. Now,
Wow, a smart move.
this was set at the end of 2022 and was adopted New Year's Day of 2023. In which case, you see the euro continue to expand into these non-Eurozone European Union nations, but looking at the current situation, I can only feel that with everything happening right now, we are on the collision course over the course of the end of the decade, let's say 2030, because people love 2030 as an arbitrary figure, so I'll use it myself. That by 2030, we're going to have what is more or less a continent-wide Greece if any more nations jump onto the euro. Croatia, being once again a smaller nation, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, their economy is about comparable to Greece in terms of GDP. Now, I could be off, please correct me if I am. But you have these smaller nations pegging themselves to this currency that has already taken several hits throughout 2022, is unlikely to see any great recovery in 2023, if any recovery at all, which I'm starting to doubt. Maybe there'll be a slight uptick, but in terms of anything actually to improve the lives and livelihood of people in Eurozone nations, I don't see that happening anytime in the near future, but it is once again to tie these countries further into the system. It was probably some compromise made between the Croatian government and the European Union in order to give them some kickback and give them some sort of benefit or spare them some sort of punishment, as we've seen with cases like Hungary. Even though, once again, Croatia is one of these nations that has been going off the beaten path lately. They've been cooperating with Serbia and Hungary in terms of, let's say, alternative economic arrangements outside of the European Union. So perhaps this was some sort of deal with that. I believe we would need to see more about this deal before we can really make any more speculations. So, news out of Germany is that Germany has received its first shipment of American liquefied natural gas, and it's coming to bail them out for the winter as we move forward. And that is also on top of Germany is wavering on its support for aid to Ukraine, and that it is unable to provide many of the weapon systems that have been promised, particularly when it comes to air defense systems at this time. And that has led to a degree of frustration, of course, between the German government and the Ukrainians, despite the fact that, once again, you had Baerbock over in Kharkov when there was that fireworks incident, which was, don't get me wrong, rather entertaining. But in terms of weapon shipments and in terms of just material support of the war in general, it is becoming increasingly difficult for Germany at this time to support. And there were some opinion polls out of Germany as well about sending fighting vehicles to Ukraine. 49% opposed, 40% support. And for tanks, opposition was at 50. And they also had another poll where only 25% thought the overall supplies to Ukraine should increase as well. And that is on top of, once again, them even struggling to get the systems together, which it does look like when it came to logistics that the most competent team was not in charge of being able to count what was needed. So Germany, even among public opinion, is starting to take a more hesitant approach on this war. And depending on how this winter turns out, I think that will really be a key point. Thus far, European winter has not been harsh and cold. However, we're just at the beginning. It's only, again, the beginning of January right now, so we can see as we go a little further what that will look like. And this is also on top of a two-thirds surveyed German of the German population calling on the current defense minister Christine Lambrecht to resign as well, which also signals declining support for the war effort and the German government's approach towards that. Moving on to some of the news out of Poland. Poland, of course, is asking for more and more from both Germany and the European Union to get into specific news about that. Poland believes that Germany's refusal to pay World War II reparations shows an arrogance and will create problems in the future. The office of the Polish president has stated that the country can only. The office of the Polish president has stated that the country can only conceivably provide Ukraine with a symbolic number of Leopard tanks, which also once again come from Germany, which shows a declining in amounts of supplies. And then one last piece of news out of Germany that came from the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine was, if Germany does not give Ukraine tanks, it will get a war on its territory. So just once again, these very brazen statements that are coming out of the Ukrainian ministry. Once again, I wouldn't call it exactly extortion, but I would say it's a form of, I wouldn't call it emotional, but rhetorical blackmail coming out of Ukraine at the very least. But to continue on with some of the news out of Europe at this time, we have a request for the Italian government to provide more military aid to Ukraine. And just to get the statements here, this request, of course, came from Washington, and I just need to get the exact words that were used because it was pretty telling. So, according to the newspaper La Repubblica, Washington is putting pressure on Rome to supply more weapons to Kiev. Italy, according to the publication, is very urgently asked to transfer air defense assets to Kiev as soon as possible. U.S. Assistant to the President for National Security Jake Sullivan, in a conversation with Prime Minister Maloney's diplomatic advisor Francesco Tallo, pressured Rome to provide Ukraine with military assets for air defense as soon as possible, the material says. The material of the Italian edition indicates that we are talking about anti-aircraft missile systems, and then the author of the article goes on further to say Germany, France, and the United States, of course, have already announced sending armored vehicles to Ukraine. The Italian side, in turn, has not adopted a new decree of supply of weapons. According to the journalists at the moment, there's a slowdown transfer of Italian weapons to the Kiev regime. Now, I did think this was a bit interesting, given Maloney's stated positions on the Ukraine war since before she even came in office. Now, much to my chagrin, and I'm sure to the chagrin of many of you, has been very unabashedly pro-Ukraine. I actually had a lot of hope for a new right-wing Italian government that would have a bit more sane approach. And while I am somewhat optimistic about domestic policy in the country of Italy, I'm not too optimistic about them breaking sides with the American Empire anytime in the near future, at least under this government. But it is interesting that you don't see more weapon shipments coming from Italy given the line of the Meloni government. Now, it could be because it is a coalition government. It could be because of the very volatile nature of Italian politics. They can't do anything that would be too unpopular because despite Meloni's position, she is in coalition with, once again, parties that are much less adamant about the Ukrainian cause, if not outright opposed to it. I mean, for example, you have coalitions with Lega, who in the past have had Salvini in Moscow smiling and shaking hands with Putin, for example. And of course, Berlusconi's not part of the government, but Forza is, so you do have these interests pulling in different directions. So it's interesting on that note, but it's also interesting that you see the main flow of weapons coming out of places like Poland and some of these other smaller Eastern European states. But it does seem, and once again, as Poland reported that they didn't have enough Leopard tanks to meet Ukrainian demands, that as arsenals in Eastern Europe are depleted, it's crawling more and more westward. And I do have some news about some of the French weapon shipments. You have some news about the German weapon shipments. And now they're trying to put pressure on Italy to up the weapon shipments as well.
Yes, especially air defense.
Yes, air defense, which they have been panicking about. And I mean, thus far, there's been the debates with the procurement of weapon shipments in the U.S. that I believe the most recent package had one Patriot missile system in the country. It's shipped to Ukraine, so that was that should show the state of current logistics in the West in terms of being able to provide the proper military support. That was once again was referenced extensively in that nice little piece by the Jamestown Foundation that we read through. But you have Zelensky also asking probably the most powerful nation in Europe about weapon shipments and cooperation between the nations. So he spoke to the Prime Minister of North Macedonia,
Oh
Kovachevsky,
yes,
about
yeah.
cooperation between the two nations, and once again stripping these small nations of whatever reserves they have left. And I mean that was the reason countries like Macedonia and Montenegro and all these other small statelets were even admitted into NATO, so they could be a funnel of weapons to Ukraine or wherever in the event of that. And that is the entire purpose of it at the end of the day. So you have a nation, I mean, what's Macedonia's active military personnel? It has to be no more than 1,000 troops. I mean, it's a small country of 2 million in terms of military might. They're not exactly the bastion that you would have sending weapons abroad, so once again, playing into that. But also while we're in the Balkans, Bulgaria has yet to renew its gas deals with Russia. And before we get into some of the news out of Kosovo, we do have some brief news about Turkey, where John Bolton has come out of the woodwork and he has returned to demand that Turkey be expunged from NATO and that they
Yeah,
no
yes,
longer
I read
play a part
about this.
in the alliance. So, once again, getting into the undermining of NATO as an organization with Turkey as the linchpin, Bolton, and he made comments along these lines about a year ago, up to a few months ago, where he is adamant about seeing Turkey out of NATO and sees Turkey as the next major threat and how they must be brought to heel. And that is what most of his attention has been focused on ever since the Trump debacle got over, ever since he got his prominence in the media over coming out and being the inside man who tried to steer Trump right, but ultimately could not succeed. And that should show the direction things are going. But with NATO, you also have Turkey holding out on Finnish and Swedish membership to this day, and they keep kicking that can down the road, and they're still trying to meet certain arbitrary demands from NATO in order to move forward with the exception of the process. But also in the process of NATO membership, it was said that Sweden would be admitted in the case of a war against Russia, which sort of undermines it, but I mean, it gives away the exact purpose. And the Finnish foreign minister, Havitso, claiming that nuclear weapons will not be deployed on the territory of Finland after its accession to NATO, which is most likely not true, I can imagine. But that, what we have right there, is just some of the brief news out of Europe. But to get into something a bit more substantial that came out of Europe was the shootings in Kosovo over the past week.
Mm-hmm.
So there was an instance, of course, it was Christmas on the Julian calendar, which is when is celebrated by Serbs in the Orthodox Church in Serbia. And there was a drive-by shooting which had 3 casualties. Now, as far as I know, there were no deaths. Now, that was the last I checked. I could be wrong if there's updated information about that. But I know one of them was as young as about 12 or 13 in this drive-by shooting. And this was done by, of course, an ethnic Albanian. And this is on top of all the tensions which have occurred just in Kosovo over the course of the past several months. And what's looking like is probably going to lead to some sort of conflict sooner than later. Now, in terms of Serbian direct action in Kosovo, it's doubtful anything like that would happen soon, but the small pockets of Serbs plus anyone who would cross the border forming paramilitary groups in order to bring about a conflict is in the realm of possibility. Now, of course, there is the 1244 declaration, which says that they can go in, that they're entitled under certain provisions under the UN can actually go in. Now, we all know if it actually came to applying that, that would be immediately thrown out the window. They'd find some loophole around that. So I don't even like to discuss something like that in terms of what's actually in the deck of cards. But once again, as I had stated on some of the previous shows, if we don't see some degree of conflict reawaken to the degree it already hasn't in Kosovo before the end of the year, I will be genuinely surprised. And it is also telling. You do see between the incident in Ukraine that you had brought up earlier in the show and this, that the proxies of the American empire are turning to these terror tactics en masse. I can't imagine these two will be the last instance, and I can't imagine that Kosovo and Ukraine will be the last places to see anything like this. I mean, you can even go all the way back to Iraq, Syria, with some of the U.S. proxy groups there to see what happened there. But this, unfortunately, probably is going to be a growing trend with these sort of events happening. Now, I'm not saying this particular instance was arranged by the CIA or State Department, but they create the situation that directly facilitates something like this. And of course, as tensions grow, I would not put them past them in the slightest in order to encourage and facilitate these kind of situations, these kind of attacks, and these kind of what can only really be called acts of terror in the future. And with that being said, you do have some good news coming out of the Kosovo situation, that Hungary has said that they will block Kosovo's membership in any organizations, whether it be the EU, NATO, etc., and that Hungary will definitively vote against because it will harm relations with Serbia, them outright adding that as well. And really, aside from the US and the UK, the Kosovo project is losing a great amount of support. Even countries that officially recognize it haven't gone to great lengths to further cooperation or integration with Kosovo at this time. It's really the US, UK, and Albania are the only countries that are steadfastly standing behind it at this moment. And I can only imagine as the situation continues onward, although states might not pull recognition, there'll be less countries, even the ones who do officially recognize Kosovo, that are less likely to stand behind it because of the volatile situation it can become. Now, once the U.S. cracks the whip on Europe again, we'll see how many of them fall in line. Once they crap the whip abroad, just anywhere, we'll see how many countries fall in line. But there will not be as many countries as, say, 1999 or 2008 that will stand behind Kosovo, in my estimation at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'll start it this way. There was a story out of Germany about a lot of guys basically retiring from the military, and Germany is having a difficult time
like the U.S. is in finding recruits, and I think that underpins what you're talking about, and that is, a lot of Europe has had just about enough. They don't want a second war. There might still be a good deal, and probably is still a good deal of support for Ukraine on principle, but a second war in the Balkans, uh, yes, of course, it's only going to be the Albanians and the Anglos that are going to be interested, right? No one else wants this. And it's brave of Hungary to stop it, to get in the way of that. Orban is amazing in this regard, right? Um, so that's what I think it comes down to. Everybody is kind of holding their breath. I think a lot of people want the war in Ukraine to end in whatever way possible, and they want their lives to return back to normal, but they won't, because their leadership just will not tolerate it. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't. I suppose that's really the best way you can put it. And as for European news, that is all I had for the moment. But if you have anything more on Europe, certainly say your piece. If not, I do have a.
Um, no, I mean, not really. The Financial Times did an article about Surovikin, the new general involved over the entire special military operation, instead of being one of 4 or 5 different generals. Um, I mean, they've tacitly had to admit that his strategy is working. Um, but you've already covered Finland and Sweden. Um, I covered Baerbock. I mean, there is other news out of Europe, but that's what stood out for me. But other than that, I don't really have anything else.
Okay, and I do have just a bit more news to close the show. Just out of the Middle East, Asia, and just touching on some of the events in Brazil. So, talks between Turkey and Syria have progressed in recent weeks and are starting to reflect what they once were. So, just to quote here, Ankara, following talks held in Moscow, agreed to withdraw Turkish military from territories controlled by them in northwest Syria, according to the Syrian newspaper Al Watan. Now, according to sources in the publication, the result of the meeting of the defense ministers of Russia, Syria, and Turkey was, quote, Turkey's consent to the complete withdrawal of Turkish forces from the occupied area in the north of Syria, as well as Ankara's confirmation of its intention to respect the sovereignty and integrity of Syrian territories. So it does continue with that, and Erdogan also did not rule out a meeting with Assad for the quote for the sake of the peace of Syria, and Erdogan did not rule out holding a personal meeting with Assad following the talks of the foreign ministers. Erdogan said this on Thursday at a meeting with the regional representatives of the Justice and Development Party led by him. Quote, the heads of the defense ministries of Turkey, Russia, and Syria held talks in Moscow. The meeting of foreign ministers of the 3 countries to be held. Then our personal meetings can take place for the sake of ensuring peace in Syria, said Erdogan. So, given the current trajectory with the successful meeting of the defense ministers and the upcoming meeting of the foreign ministers that will take place, the possibility of a summit between Assad and Erdogan, mediated by Putin, is very well within the cards. Now, many thought that was going to happen before some of the recent flare ups in Syria led to a bit of a reversal of course, and that has also caused panic in Idlib with the
Yeah.
with the HTS leaders there who are in quote panic, and that's according to South Front. So, in a video released by HTS Media Network Amjad on January 2nd, Abu Muhammad al Jilani has called the ongoing talks between the two countries a serious deviation. Quote, the ongoing Russia-sponsored talks between Ankara and Damascus are a dangerous deviation that affects the goals of the Syrian revolution, the leader said in the video message, which was titled, "We Will Not Reconcile." Addressing the Syrian regime, al-Julani said, "Do not rejoice with what is happening, for what has passed is more than what remains, and your hour is approaching." I, I, I have to say, I can't help but crack up at the rhetoric of these videos, whether they be from like the early 2000s or like from today, especially today with us 20 years removed from like the height of the Al Qaeda nonsense. That it's completely laughable, and there's really no other way to put it. So just to continue on reading briefly from the article, al-Julani went on to call on an all-militant armed factions in Greater Idlib and nearby Turkish-occupied areas in North Syria to join HTS in the face of challenge presented by Moscow and Ankara. This call was likely an attempt by the terrorist leader to take advantage of the situation to further expand the influence of the group. HTS released a video message following on reports for plans of a Turkish withdrawal in northern Syria that was being discussed during the breakdown meeting between the defense ministers of Ankara and Damascus last month. Syria and its allies halted their ground operations against HTS and other terrorist groups in Greater Idlib in 2020 to avoid confrontation with Turkey, who deployed large force in the region. Thus, any Turkish withdrawal likely marked the end of HTS. It's worth noting that HTS stepped up its attacks on the Syrian government forces around Greater Idlib in the last few weeks in what appears to be an attempt to stir up tensions between Damascus and Ankara. And despite facing some criticism from Syrian opposition, Turkey is going forward with the plan to restore ties with Syria. The foreign ministers of the two countries are set to meet in Moscow in the second half of the month. Al-Julani's panic from the talks between Ankara and Damascus confirmed the importance of Russia's efforts in this regard. The main target of the talks is to form a joint mechanism to eliminate all terrorist groups in Syria. So, once again, continuing on with the current peace process in Syria, I'm going to do something I probably shouldn't and say the summer of 2023 will be the last summer of Idlib.
You know what? There's a very strong chance.
Well, there was a very long...
Sure. Because, I mean, especially because Erdogan wants to get reelected. And the Turkish people they're tired of the refugees. They want to unload them. They're going, yes, recently it was discovered that since November 2022, the Turks are supplying Ukraine with cluster bombs, right? Be that as it may, Erdogan wants to get reelected, okay? And his popularity is not in shambles, but it's like he's more popular than Biden, but he's not as popular as Putin. The people are they're done with the refugees. They're about 5 million now, and they need solutions to redistribute them. And Turkey moving out of that zone that they took over in 2016 that Obama encouraged them to do, because it would, of course, complicate the matters there even more. This is sort of like a pattern. America always chooses just create chaos. Maybe something good will happen. Maybe things will go in your direction. So, and we all know Turkey's going in a certain direction that even John Bolton isn't happy with it. Bolton says he might even run for president. For the
yes,
Republican
I have
Party.
seen that.
He's gone that bonkers. So Bolton he's an old war hawk. He's very worried about Turkey becoming a liability for NATO. I mean, if I was a fanatic like him, I'd be worried too, to be honest. This is the guy who says, yes, we're arming Iranian separatists and so on, and that's a good thing. So I would say Idlib, yes, Idlib is in danger of being pushed out. I think the Kurds are in trouble. Now, what will the Kurds do with the Americans? That's the rub, right? Because there are more and more MLRS attacks on American bases. There have been two attacks, um, like literally in the last 6 days. Um, so they're getting emboldened. Iran is shipping a air defense system. Iran is also getting another batch of Su-35s. They are going to get Su-34s. Um, and this is going to change the game, right? And I think Putin has another ace up his sleeve, and that is like if things look bad or desperate for him. I mean, right now they've signed a contract to build ships together. Um, there's military exchanges. Putin could help them to develop nuclear bombs faster, and that would change everything in the Middle East with a nuclear Iran, right? This is something that America doesn't want. You know, Syria was supposed to fall a long time ago. It should have been a failed state like Libya. You know, disintegration, reintegration, as the article pointed out that you read. Um, so yeah, I'm not so worried I'm not so worried about the jihadists in Idlib. Like, I would not be surprised if Turkey did have terrorist attacks, but that will not endear them. They will lose their position in Idlib if they do that. I'm not saying they won't, but they will lose that position. The Kurds, I think, are another batch altogether. The Americans rely on the Kurds an awful lot. It's how they keep their bases going.
I mean, the Kurds are the basis of the current troubles in Iran right now. You have to remember that as
Yeah,
well. And
yeah,
that's okay. So, just for a bit of a preface, when it comes to the destabilization within Iran, primarily it has not been the Kurds who have been the forefront of cooperation with the U.S. It's been groups like MEK and it's been other distant groups. But this time in 2022, when you had the most recent bout of protests beginning, they started in the Kurdish regions with this incident involving a Kurdish woman. So this is really a stepping up and showing the reliance of the U.S. and the Kurds in the region because they're really the last people they can rely on to be steadfast because the Kurds, for whatever reason, have wed themselves to American imperial policy.
right. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, there's the Americans are trying to create another base. I think it's an old base that Trump gave to the Russians that they've reacquisitioned. But tell you the truth, like for the Americans to make a difference there, they're going to have to create a bigger presence because really in 2022, um, you had the odd person who would shoot at one of those American convoys, or the Russians would play dare games where they would force the Russians to drive the Americans to drive off the road, or block, or protests of like 25 people would block the road and whatever. But rocket attacks are really another level,
Well,
right?
yes, I was actually just about to get into that because there was a gas facility that was hit by rockets in
Yes.
Syria just on January 4th. And that is after Israeli strikes on Syria, which did have the casualty of a Syrian officer as well. That happened just a few days before that. So we're seeing a return to some of the, I would say, 2018 headlines out of Syria. And as you were saying, we have had a significant amount of troops withdrawn from Syria. So in order to reassert itself, especially under a much more hostile environment in Syria for the time being,
Hmm.
because there was, for the longest time, Syria or its allied forces or the Iranian-backed forces wouldn't interfere too much with the U.S. force in the region, especially with the fight during ISIS because they were united loosely by a common enemy. But ever since then, ever since the recent years, I would say, I think it was about 2020 when you really had the assassination of Soleimani and the strikes on the U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria in retaliation. that it has stepped up with that, and that you've slowly, in both Iraq and Syria, have had dwindling numbers of American presence there. So it would require a rather large effort that I really don't think the U.S. is willing to commit to right now in order to reestablish itself in the region. Otherwise, it's going to be left relying solely on the Kurdish forces. Now, maybe if Ukraine takes a very, very harsh turn for the American empire and in favor of Russia, they will reorient their strategy to Syria. And once again,
It's possible.
you do have to remember there was that article from the Hill kvetching about, oh, America can't abandon Syria. America can't abandon Ukraine the same way it abandoned Afghanistan. But I would have to say things would have to go disastrously in Ukraine for the American empire in order for them to reorient to Syria again. Because otherwise, I think even the most foaming at the mouth neoconservatives have conceded that Syria is a lost cause.
Hmm. Hmm. Like you say, um, if things continue to go badly for Ukraine, maybe America steps up its presence in Syria. That will be more difficult to sell to the American public. They will wonder, like, why are you banning Ukraine now for Syria? It'll, the endless wars tagline will hashtag will reappear on Twitter and on bumper stickers. Um, I'm not sure. I think, the Americans are the average American is glad that America's not in Afghanistan, you know. Um,
Absolutely.
many are probably
Decide the
many
wounded
are probably
pride.
asking, why are they still in
Yeah.
Syria? So, I mean, it's possible because you can tell. I mean, it's just a very serious situation right now for the American empire. Um, like them dominating Europe and deindustrializing Europe, it's a power move, sure, but they don't want to lose Europe either. On the other hand, can they afford to keep Europe afloat? Because they know if there's economic hardship, right, in Europe, there's certain political tendencies that will start to arise that they don't like.
Yeah, and with that being said, when it comes just to the dynamics of the American empire, and I think just because the how long the show's running, we'll get to some of the still stuff on the next episode, just
Yeah.
to and just sort of round things out. But with that being said, with the American empire, because of Iraq and Afghanistan, especially Iraq, which then expanded into Syria, as well as our other various interventions in the Middle East, all the tensions with Iran, even among a lot of the Americans who are very gung ho about Ukraine, intervention in the Middle East has left a very sour taste in their mouth that cannot be done away with easily. So, in terms of re-intervening in the Middle East, the will simply isn't there. But when it comes to America asserting itself in Europe, asserting greater control over Europe, the will is at least there enough, or the combination of the will and the apathy is there enough in order for America to continue most of its Ukraine policy and certainly its policy in regards to American-European relations. And many have said as a result of this, and I'm sure you've seen these theories going around, that America and the West and the American empire are in a much stronger position for it. And again, this has been going around since the beginning of the war, that this has solidified the position of the American empire. And while on the surface, yes, it does appear that way, and I would even say in the short term that is the case, there is no long-term sustainability behind this. There is no long-term sustainability behind the American policy in Europe and Ukraine, and that while it has bought itself a stronger position for the time being, unless we do get the fantasy scenario described in that Jamestown Foundation article, that is going to be very short-lived.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
But that's all I had for this episode, and we had some stuff about Mexico and Brazil and the
We should do
instance.
that. We should do another episode, maybe just later
Yeah, I was
this week.
Yeah, I was thinking we could probably record on Thursday, put it out Friday, but that's some post production stuff that I don't think we need to get into on air. But yeah, I was thinking much the same. But yeah, that article ate up a far greater chunk of time than I expected, but I think it was certainly worth doing that. And of course, there was a lot to cover on Ukraine and Europe, but that is all I had for the time being, just to keep the show a reasonable length, a reasonable 2.5 hours. I hope everyone enjoyed this episode. Of course, keep your eye out for us on the alternative platforms because you know how fickle YouTube can be. And we will see you in all likelihood later this week. And goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.